Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our virtual Lunch and Learn. I'm Damika Withers. I am the Chief Economic Equity and Inclusion Officer here for Franklin County Board of County Commissioners. We are going to give folks some time to come into our virtual Lunch and Learn for Juneteenth. And with us is Dr. Jeffries and Dr. Walsh. So we're going to give some folks some time to get in before we get started. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you. Again, those who are joining, I want to thank all of you for being here for our virtual Juneteenth Lunch and Learn to learn more about our Juneteenth history and celebrate Juneteenth today. I am Damika Withers. I am the Chief Economic Equity and Inclusion Officer. I want to welcome everyone to our Franklin County virtual Lunch and Learn session. Last year, the commissioners made Juneteenth a paid holiday for Board of County Commissioner employees, training it for Columbus Day. So this year is the first time county employees are formally recognizing the Juneteenth holiday. It is a holiday that has been celebrated in some places for more than 150 years, but we know there are many people who may not know much about it. Juneteenth is a celebration that commemorates the freeing of American slaves. So we want to learn more about the history and significance of this holiday and share it with our audience today. I am pleased to welcome our guests, OSU history professor Hassan Kwame Jeffries and Chuck Walsh, director of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. Welcome, gentlemen, to our Lunch and Learn for Juneteenth. I really appreciate both of you for being here. Can you both take a minute to tell us more and the people who are listening today about yourselves and some of your work, your background, or areas of expertise? Dr. Walsh?
Yes, I'll go. Thank you. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today. This is really important. I'm really excited. And just hats off to the entire Board of Commissioners for taking the step to make this a paid holiday for Franklin County employees in place of the recognition of Columbus Day. It just speaks volumes for what the board is doing in the direction that I think not only we're going in the county, but also as a nation is really, really important. So again, I am Chuck Walsh. I'm the director of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center, which is a division of the Ohio History Connection. And our museum is located in Wilberforce, Ohio. A little bit about what I do, aside from managing the day-to-day of the museum in Wilberforce, by virtue of the fact that I'm a division director, I'm a part of the leadership structure within the Ohio History Connection. So we work, or at least I work, from a perspective of organization-wide issues and help steer the organization as a whole in a really positive direction that we're doing now. My background a little bit, because this is museum work, museum administration, so I'm in public history, but I come from an academic background. So all of my degrees are in history with a focus really on the African diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, what are you doing running an African-American museum if your focus is on slavery and the slave trade in Latin America and the Caribbean? That's a much longer story. Definitely don't have time to get into all of that. But I did all of my research in Brazil, in Northeastern Brazil. I love that research. One day I'll publish it. But I actually, while studying Latin American history, Caribbean history, slave trade. I always kept up with my colleagues who were studying African American history. So I always studied that at the same time. And my perspective is one that I started to see how very unique African American history and culture really is, because I would always juxtapose that to similar things that are going on elsewhere, and how like Latin America, Caribbean has so many things in common.
Yeah.
But then when you get here, the United States is like, something's different going on here. And it made me appreciate African American history and culture on a much deeper level than had I studied it within a vacuum. So some of my perspectives and my take on history comes from, in my opinion, a little bit more of a holistic view rather than looking at African American history within the confines of the United States. So I'm always excited to talk about it, because in public history, especially administration, it's like, we don't want to hear the academic side. Let's just get down to business. And, this is, I love this. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Wash, and I appreciate all the work you have done in this space and in education, because it's so very important. And it sounds like we need another lunch and learn scheduled so we can have some of that historical context shared with us and learn more. I also want to give Dr. Jeffries the opportunity to introduce himself and talk about the work and his expertise.
Thank you very much. To echo Dr. Wash, it's just really an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, to be with those who are on the call, and tremendous thanks to the commissioners for, as Dr. Wash said, pointing out, making this Juneteenth a holiday, a paid holiday, right? For county officials, county employees. That is a meaningful step, a meaningful action. So certainly kudos to that. I teach, as you pointed out, I teach African American history and U.S. history at the Ohio State University. Been teaching here on faculty at Ohio State for about 18 years now. But I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and then headed down to Morehouse College, historically Black college, down in Atlanta, Georgia, for my undergrad, where I majored in history. Knew I wanted to continue to study and learn about the African American experience as a way to better understand the conditions and circumstances that Black folk were in today. And then from there, I headed up to North Carolina. I actually thought I was in the South when I was in Atlanta, and then I went to North Carolina. I was like, oh, a little Durham. I was like, oh, okay, now I'm in the South at Duke University. But then I did my research on civil rights in Alabama, moved to Alabama. I was like, oh, now I'm in the South. I was playing around before. And so, focused on the African American experience in the South and Black protests and Black organizing, civil rights and Black power. Spent a year at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa before coming up here to Ohio. I said I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, but I actually have roots here in Ohio. My family was enslaved, talking about Juneteenth, my family was enslaved in Georgia on my father's side, the Jeffries side. But then in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, migrated out of Georgia to Akron, Ohio, part of that wave of the Great Migration, and settled in Akron, Ohio. And then a branch of that family, my grandfather, was eventually sent to live with an older sister. Familiar story to many in the Black community in Newark, New Jersey. And so we wound up growing up there. So it wasn't a surprise, although my uncle told me, he said, one day you're gonna get you're gonna get a cousin in your class at Ohio State. And I was like, go on, stop playing, you playing around. And then sure enough, about 2 years after, my little Shannon showed up, and I was like, oh, it's a small world, but that's what the community is, right? We're talking about Juneteenth as something that was a regional in origin, but then becomes national because Black folk have these national connections.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Jeffries. Both of you come with a wealth of great personal and professional information. And you are exactly right. Juneteenth is one of those holidays that we have to discuss that separation that happens so much in the Black community. Let's get right into this important conversation for our audience today. Can both of you provide a little historical context for our listeners? President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, which declared the slaves in the Confederacy were free, but of course, the Civil War was still going on. So that didn't actually mean that they were freed. That war ended in 1865, but still not all slaves were free right away, were they? Can someone expand upon that and provide us some history regarding that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this and so start us off. As you rightly point out, Abraham Lincoln issues a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, and essentially he was offering to those who were in rebellion, the Confederacy, those who were in rebellion, sort of a fig leaf. They said, look, and think about the framing of this. Think about the framing, because the Civil War wasn't about ending slavery. I mean, Black folk wanted it to be about ending slavery. Lincoln was like, no, this is about preserving the Union. So there's a great irony in the Civil War, in that the Confederacy, the Southern enslavers, are fighting a war to preserve the institution of slavery. And Lincoln is like, nah, we're not trying to end slavery, right? And so he issues this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, September 22, 1862. And he says to enslavers, he says, look, if y'all can keep your property, quote unquote, y'all can keep Black folk in bondage if you just put down your arms. That was it. And he said, but if you don't, then on January 1, 1863, 100 days later, your enslaved folk will be free, right? And of course, he does not have the military authority to do that, because those the folk he declared free are in states that are under control of this insurrectionist force. And ironically, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free anybody. In fact, it re-enslaves more people than it frees, because it says slavery is in those states where that are not in rebellion, slavery is still fine. And so there are parts of, or those sections, so there are parts of Louisiana, literally where Black folk get re-enslaved. And so the Emancipation Proclamation has this sort of odd, history. And so we're so obsessed with Lincoln, the great emancipator, and we realize, this is more military measure than anything else, allowing African-American soldiers to be enlisted and recruited into the Army and into the Navy. So that's an important caveat that we understand, that we have to understand. But the Emancipation Proclamation was meaningful, because although it doesn't free anybody, it does mean that the Civil War, is going to be now a war not just to preserve the Union, but a war to end slavery. And there was no going back at that point. And so Black folk, not in the South, certainly understood that, and were paying attention and could hear through the grapevine that this thing was coming. But Black folk outside the South were waiting for it. And so we see on New Year's Eve of January 1863, Black folk gathered in churches in cities across the North, in Boston, here in Ohio, and they're waiting, right, to receive word for January to come that this Emancipation Proclamation is going to take effect. And this becomes really the first Emancipation Day celebrations as it relates to slavery in America, because you would find that after, finally, once the war was over, that people would gather on New Year's Eve and celebrate emancipation. This becomes the basis for those watch night services that you have in Black churches to this day. That was born in this Emancipation Day era. But then, as you pointed out rightly so, and I'll wrap this up and pass it to Brother Walsh in a second. You know, then you have the end of the war itself, and you're right. The war ends slavery, but there ain't no internet, right? So there isn't instantaneous communication at the time. So it takes time for word to spread to Texas. Texas is the westernmost outpost of the Confederacy. But more important than just word spreading, nothing was going to happen until you had troops arrive. These former enslavers, these enslavers at the time, they weren't going to give up anything unless they were forced to, even though they had just lost the war. And so on June 19th in Galveston, Texas, when you get Union troops arrive there, that's when 3 months after the war had ended, that word is finally given, and the presence of those troops allow for slavery to finally come to an end in the United States at that moment.
Wash, before you expand upon that, I want to tell the audience as well that there is a question and answer box throughout our virtual Lunch and Learn today. So please enter your questions into the question and answer. That box is either below or at top of your screen, depending on which Zoom you have. So please, we will answer those questions here live for you. Dr. Walsh, if you would like to expand upon what Dr. Jeffries has explained and also discuss with us. Dr. Jeffries has set the tone saying about the June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. Talk a little bit about what that scene was like.
Okay, the first thing is, and I'm so glad Dr. Jeffries mentioned this and kind of alluded to a lot of other things. With the Emancipation Proclamation, I know even people in my family, and my family's originally from Mississippi. And just like Dr. Jeffries' family, they migrated to Michigan. I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, grew up there. And they're under the impression that the Emancipation Proclamation is what ended slavery. That was the thing that we're supposed to celebrate. And a part of that thinking is the notion, and Dr. Jeffries mentioned this as well, the notion of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. He's given such enormous and intense just credit for something that we need to really explore and really push back on, to be honest. The way I look at it is there's a continuation here of the fight for civil rights and for freedom that we tend to ignore. So when I look at African-American history, right, I look at our involvement in the 7 Years' War, which on this side of the ocean we call the French and Indian War, 1756. Blacks fought in that, right? They were fighting on both sides. And they weren't just fighting because, oh, this is the right thing to do. It's like, well, we're fighting for our freedom at the same time. So then you can fast forward and go to Revolutionary War, which was next. They fought on both sides of that as well. They're fighting for freedom. You can go forward, the War of 1812. You can go to the Civil War itself. So the notion that, like Abraham Lincoln, he's this great benevolent emancipator. You guys were given your freedom. That freedom was already earned generations before the Civil War itself. And what we tend to forget, and anybody who grew up in, like a Black community, Black neighborhood, people remember things. That memory is alive in these communities from coast to coast, border to border. And people realize that, wait a minute, we've fought and we've earned, we've fought and we've earned, we've re-earned, we had to continue to fight. So when we talk about the fight for equal justice today, that's a continuation from many generations ago. This is what we've been doing in this country. And I think we need to realize what that continuation is. That freedom wasn't given. The Emancipation Proclamation, that really, like Dr. Jeffries said, it didn't really free anyone. Like, come on, it wasn't meant to. I don't know how many times I've had to read it word for word to students so that they could understand, like, it was never meant to end slavery. He literally wrote that in there. Those border states, those 5 border states, right, including West Virginia, that was pretty brand new at that point, they were written out of it. It's like, this does not affect those states that did not rebel. And it was a caveat. If you rejoin the Union by this date, all is forgiven and you can continue on with slavery. It was never meant to end slavery. We have to get away from the notion that that's what did it and that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator, because the pressure on his administration was multifold to end slavery. Economic reasons, moral reasons, the whole nine. And from before that, like if we were to like dig into the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, it was clearly written in there that slavery was wrong and that we're doing these people a great injustice. They blamed King George at the time, but the idea was it was so much pressure that the Black community, both free and enslaved, was putting on the government that they had to acknowledge it. Like, we can't live this paradox. We're fighting for our freedom, yet we're keeping them in bondage. And it's not like, well, we're doing them wrong. No, they heard from the people themselves. Fast forward to Abe Lincoln, he's hearing from free and enslaved people directly. You have to do something about this. Don't tell us publicly that it's not about slavery. It's about slavery.
Right.
Because the economy revolves around this. You know where your bread is buttered in a sense, right? So they're talking about this. So the pressure for Emancipation Proclamation to be what it was, the 13th Amendment that actually ended slavery, we got to stop writing those Black folks out of that history, because they're the ones that spurred all of that. They weren't, what do you call, like passive bystanders. No, they were active. It had always been active. So when we talk about the cultural cornerstones of African-American history and culture itself, I mean, involvement, whether the public at large wants us to be involved or not. We're involved. We're
Right.
gonna have our say, and we're gonna move things. We're gonna make things happen, whether you want to move them and make it happen or not. So that's the thing about this whole like Juneteenth. That Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anyone, but we've taken it, we've made it a symbol of freedom. We made it a symbol of something bigger than what it actually was at the time. Like you said, it was regional, and then because of how Black community is, it just became national, because my folks down in Texas, they spread out to California. They went to back to the north, stuff like that, and it became more national. But it's more of a symbol for something larger than that.
Thank you. And we have a question from one of our audience members, Deborah Brackney Warner, who wants to know, how did the Freedoms Bureau Act come about?
Certainly, I'll leave that to Dr. Jeffries.
Yeah, certainly the Freedmen's Bureau. So when slavery ends, you have 4 million formerly enslaved folk who now have their freedom. And it's a question of, okay, how do we assist these folk to transition from bondage into freedom? Now, I think and so the Freedmen's Bureau is essentially the federal agency that is created that is charged with the task of helping formerly enslaved folk transition from slavery to freedom. And that's sort of the basic history of it. But I think what's critically important to understand is not everybody had the same vision of what freedom ought to be. And so you really have three parties at play here. You have the formerly enslaved African Americans who have their own vision of what freedom is. Just as Brother Walsh was pointing out, Black folk are actors in their own, active agents in their own liberation. And we have to take enslaved folks seriously as political thinkers. They understood what basic civil rights and human rights they should have, that are entitled to as members of the society and as human beings. And they identified those based upon the experiences that they had while they were enslaved. This broad section, I call them freedom rights, but this broad section of rights that they had been denied while they were enslaved. And as they transition into freedom, they're like, these are the things that we want. These are the things that give freedom meaning. Frederick Douglass, just after Appomattox, is giving a speech, and he says, for one, that freedom is meaningless unless only men could vote at the time, unless Black men have the vote. And so Black folk have a clear understanding of what freedom ought to look like, and they pursue that. And this becomes part of that ongoing struggle, right? The same rights that Black folk are pursuing now, they were pursuing in the civil rights era, they were pursuing then. So Black people had this vision, but the Northern whites also had a vision of what freedom was. And the Freedmen's Bureau becomes the sort of agency through which they attempt to enact that vision. And it wasn't the same as Black folk. We have to be clear that a belief in white supremacy wasn't something that was just confined to white Southerners. It was a national ideology of understanding. Ohio comes in as a free state that is opposed to the institution of slavery in 1803. So it's on the right side of history, but for the wrong reasons. They didn't want slavery here in Ohio because white people in Ohio didn't want Black people here in Ohio. And so they still believe, white Northerners shared this belief in white supremacy. And so we see, for example, the Freedmen's Bureau, which is supposed to be empowering African Americans, is really operating under this belief that the only way to jumpstart the Southern economy, which is what white Northerners were most interested in, was to get Black people working again on the land. But they only believed that Black people could work on the land effectively if they were working under the supervision of white people, right? So the Freedmen's Bureau, although tasked with empowering Black folk, in many ways does just the opposite. And so there's that tension there. And then finally, that third party, there's a tension as well. And that's with white Southerners, because slavery's over, but they did not give up their belief in white supremacy and their belief that they are entitled to control Black labor. And so as we move from slavery to freedom, as we celebrate and mark this sort of moment of Juneteenth, it's the day of Jubilee that people have prayed for generations, but it doesn't mean that the road to equality, we had reached the end of the road to equality. It is still a struggle that will go on going forward because of this tension around what freedom will actually mean.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries, and thank you, Dr. Walsh. And you're right, we are still on this road to equality. And one of the questions in the chat lends to another question to move forward with our conversation around Juneteenth. Why Galveston is the question that Jonathan Wright has proposed. So on June 19th, 1865, word finally reached Galveston, Texas, why Galveston, Texas, and how did the idea of Juneteenth celebration spread?
Okay.
Well, I would just, real quickly. So when we look at, and I think Dr. Jeffries kind of mentioned this a little earlier, when we look at the South, right, the Confederacy as a whole, and the tenets within the Emancipation Proclamation, the idea was we're going to end slavery, but in order to do that, we have to occupy those areas where slavery exists. Because we have to remember, the Confederate States of America was a separate country, right?
Mhm.
They had
Right.
their own president, vice president, currency, the whole nine. And just because the United States issues what is essentially an executive order, it's not a law. We got to keep that straight. It's not a law. Just the equivalent of an executive order doesn't mean the Confederate States of America is going to follow that. So it's basically you have to be occupied by the Northern Army or the Union Army. And we look at, and Dr. Jeffries mentioned this is the westernmost portion of the Confederacy. And if you know where Galveston, Texas is, it's very far south in Texas. It just took time to get that far west, that far south to actually occupy those areas. So that, in a sense, that's kind of very simplifying it, but in a sense, it has a lot to do with its location. So as they occupy some of the more northern, southern areas, emancipation happened a lot earlier for those people. But in some areas within Texas, even after that, it's like they found ways around making sure the enslaved stayed on the land, because there's a lot of, and I want to say some of the WPA papers, the oral histories that followed the end of slavery, some people commented on the numbers of Blacks being killed specifically in Texas because they were still made to work the land. And for those who tried to escape or run away, they were summarily killed. Some of them shot, a lot of them were hung, and we tend to ignore that. Freedom didn't always mean freedom. And as a historian, I know Dr. Jeffries knows all about that. Freedom doesn't always mean freedom. It's not always, a large, great celebration. Everything is fine now because the Union Army is here. Like, no, they came from a very different perspective. And I even saw some interviews, I believe it was in Virginia, just to illustrate the point where some soldiers were caught from the Confederacy. And a lot of people say, well, Blacks didn't actually fight for the Confederacy. Some were captured on the battlefield. Now, what were they doing on the battlefield? Were they just cleaning up bodies? You can make a debate about that, but they were interviewed and like, why are you with the Confederacy? And the response, simplified response, was that, we understand the South. We understand the mentality. We don't understand the North. We don't know what you guys are about, where you're coming from. I'd rather trust what I'm familiar with. So when we talk about just this whole notion, it's like, we got to stop simplifying this history and start really digging into the nuances. Because I was just reading one of the comments about, I think it was from Nate Sikora. I don't want to jump into this going ahead, but what we're teaching in schools is almost like, well, we don't want to make it too complicated for our students. I think our students can handle the truth. And it's nuanced, and we have to start going at it that way.
Absolutely. Dr. Jeffries, did you have any comments that you would like to add?
Yeah, only that Dr. Wash hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's almost an accident of geography that it's Galveston, and it's all about sort of location, and that westernmost point, and then access as an access point coming out of the Gulf to Texas, and that we say it's when word finally reached that part of Texas, but we also know that there are folk who will literally still be in literal bondage. Still in slavery as the troops move through. And I think the point there, and this is why actually Juneteenth as a holiday is so important, because it's a point of entry for discovery. It's a point of entry for learning more, not just about the holiday and the announcement, but what came before slavery and what came after, these sort of neo forms of slavery. What did freedom look like? Let's talk about Reconstruction. And so that's critically important. And hopefully, we will do that. We don't make sort of Juneteenth also should be a learning holiday. We'll have our cookout. That's all right. We'll play a little music, but it should be a learning occasion as well. Just as just as MLK should be a day of service and not just a day of shopping,
Absolutely.
Juneteenth should be a time to come together, to celebrate, to commemorate, to reflect, to learn, and to explore.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. And thank you for providing a lot of historical context. And I'm sure as I am learning, our audience is also learning. As you were mentioning, Dr. Jeffries, as we are beginning to celebrate Juneteenth, and a point that Dr. Wash made is that freedom didn't always mean freedom. And Dr. Jeffries mentioned that we're still on this road to equality, this road to equity. So let's talk about, when did states begin to recognize the Juneteenth holiday, and what does that really mean? And just because the state recognizes the holiday doesn't mean that people get that day off, or that it has the same statutes as other holidays. I think Dr. Walsh mentioned that there's a difference between law and executive order. So both of you can expand upon that and the holidays, and what does that mean for our states?
Well, yeah, I'll start us off. I mean, first, I think it's just looking at the history of Juneteenth. It's important to recognize that it is a regional holiday. It is a regional celebration, right? It is very Texas specific early on. It is recognized fairly early on as sort of a state holiday in Texas. But the idea of commemorating the moment of emancipation is not regionally specific. As I was saying earlier, you had these Emancipation Day celebrations within Black communities across the United States. It was just at different times. So Juneteenth becomes, sort of June. This is when they celebrate it. This is when they mark it. In Ohio, a lot of folk continued with the January 1, marking sort of freedom at that moment of the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect. In Boston, for a number of years, they celebrated sort of emancipation in December, which was connected to the 13th Amendment. In Florida, you had celebrations around emancipation that were centered around February and Lincoln's birthday. There we go, back to Lincoln. And so throughout the African American diaspora, you had these different occasions for celebrating the same thing. And one of the things that was central to all of these celebrations, particularly for the first 30 or 40 years that they were happening, because this was happening every year, was honoring Black soldiers. As Dr. Wash was pointing out, the service of African American men in particular to every major conflict in colonial U.S. history, it was consistent. And so Emancipation Day celebrations would have these parades involving former Black or veterans of the Civil War. Now, of course, they don't live forever, right? That's the first of the greatest generation. But you have brothers in New York, you had brothers in Massachusetts, you had them in the South. And so once that generation passes, and this is moving into the 1920s, early 1920s, once that generation's there, then some of that energy around Emancipation Day celebrations begins to wane, except in Texas, except in that Southwest region, where Juneteenth continues to go strong, partly because I would argue it was so close to July 4th. Right. And which means that, July 4th in the African American community has this tension, right? Like, yeah, you want us to celebrate, sort of the nation and everything that's grand and great about it. But yet, at what point do I have my full civil liberties? Right. And this isn't just about sort of, well, Black folk were still enslaved during the revolution. The revolutionary ideals and goals remained unfinished until the Civil War. They remained unfinished through the present. Right. And so there is this tension that allows, Black folk always like, this is, the double consciousness, July 4th, I don't know about this, right? But you have this alternative, you have this deeper meaning. It's like, no, let's focus on, that moment in time where we gain a little bit more freedom than we otherwise had. And so that helps Juneteenth to sort of have these legs, while at the same time, in other places around the country, as we move into the civil rights and Black power era, you have other Black communities that are like, hey, we need to mark the moment too. We need to have a different, we need to, not just that moment, but the Black freedom struggle in different ways. So I was saying that out in New York City, in the early 1970s, we start commemorating Black Solidarity Day, right? Which is, which connects to the African diaspora. Dr. Wash, as you were talking about, of Black Afro-Caribbeans who and Latinos who were in New York City with African Americans. And so you had this notion of Black solidarity. which was very much in the tradition of Juneteenth and these Emancipation Day celebrations. But as Black folk move about, as the nation shrinks a little bit because of communication and the like, that's when you begin to see, and fairly recently, really, in the 90s, early 2000s, Juneteenth becoming more and more of a national commemorative moment. And part of it had to do with it being a public celebration, right? Picking up on that parading tradition, right? Where this is a time where Black folk are going to come together. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Like, you can't be in the struggle all your life, right, without having a little joy, right? Sometimes you sit down and have a little barbecue, right? And so you also have people who are moving around, right? I mean, vendors and the like. And so it becomes this, as that mobility increases, then the tradition gains greater traction in Black communities around the country. And as that happens, you begin to see it bleed into the political sphere, where people are like, you know what, we do need to pay attention to this because we have no national moment when we pause and say, we spent 250 years holding people in bondage and then we fought a war to end it. What does this mean for us as a nation?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. Dr. Wash, go right ahead.
Yeah, it's that last point that he made. What is that point in our nation's history where we stopped everything and took stock in what was slavery, what effect did it have on the enslaved and the subsequent generations, right? Because when we look at the diaspora, the Black diaspora within this hemisphere, being more specific, there are those points where those nations were like, okay, this is what's happened, and this is how we can overcome that to make sure we build our country or build it better. Now, not every country did that. Let's be real and let's be honest. But the United States is one of those few that feels like once slavery ended, everything was great, right? We didn't need like the British colonies, right? Slavery ended there 1833. They went through a period called amelioration where they took stock in, okay, this is what happened economically. This is what we have to do to make sure everyone's incorporated within the broader economy, the broader political apparatus, all of that, because these are going to be now Black countries still within our system, but these are going to be pretty much Black countries. And we need to I don't want to take it too far and say make it right, but they did address it. We didn't do that here. We passed the 13th Amendment, then the 14th, 15th, those three amendments together, Reconstruction amendments, and we kind of wanted to move on. Everything was fine after that. We never addressed the real issues, which is why to this day, we still have a lot of the issues we have because we as a nation have not come to terms or come to grips with what slavery did to us. Who benefited, who didn't, who still is on the underside of all of that. And I really love the point Dr. Jeffries made about Juneteenth almost being this alternative to the 4th of July. And it reminded me of a part of a speech that Frederick Douglass gave while here in the state of Ohio, where he talked about the 4th of July in a sense like, why would we celebrate that? What's in that for us? Because the country turned their backs on us at that point when we helped to defend it. And he went as far as to say in so many words that there is no United States without us, without what we did at that point in time. And how could you ignore that? So why would we celebrate the 4th of July the same way that our white brothers and sisters celebrated? And to take that even further, Colonel Charles Young, who called Ohio home, lived right there in Wilberforce, Ohio, said the same thing about the 4th of July as a military colonel or lieutenant colonel. He's like, well, the 4th of July is very meaningful, but when we talk about it as a people, as a race, it doesn't have that same meaning for us. And you can't blame us for that. He actually wrote an entire paper on that. So just to kind of plug our museum, it's not just a museum, it's a full-fledged archive, and we have the world's largest, most extensive collection of Colonel Charles Young material anywhere, in case you want to do some research.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Wash. And there's a question in the chat that kind of lends to what you were speaking of regarding our great state of Ohio. Joshua Wood asked if you could speak towards the history of Ohio, Ohioans' view on slavery, and the ways in which cultural memory has had an impact on the historical teaching of the end of slavery in the United States.
I encounter the myths around sort of Ohio and slavery and race and racism all the time in the classroom. Because, as I was saying earlier, Ohio's on the right side of history when it comes to the institution of slavery, right? Not wanting it here, but it's on the right side of history for the wrong reasons, right? It does not want, you don't have slavery here because white Ohioans didn't want Black people here. They believed as much in white supremacy as any Virginian, as any Kentuckian, right? In fact, that's who is settling here, right? So they share those same beliefs. But we then take that and read the absence of slavery here to mean that white Ohioans believed in racial equality. They believed in racial egalitarianism, right? That somehow a belief in white supremacy cannot exist with those who want to see the slavery ended or not extended to the territory where they are, the state where they are. And it's absolutely not true. You can actually believe in abolition and still believe in white supremacy. And that's critically important to understand, because in the absence of that, if we don't understand that in the context of Ohio, when we see post-emancipation, when we see racial inequality, when we see racial disparities, when we see discrimination that then has this profound impact on Black opportunity and Black outcome, not only at the moment of emancipation, but all through the present, right? Then if we don't understand that racism was something that existed here, that these beliefs existed here, that they impact and shape Ohio society, then those disparities, those outcomes, the source of them isn't sort of the larger society, it's Black folk themselves. Black folk just aren't working hard enough, right? Because clearly none of those obstacles are in place here. And that thinking isn't just a 20th century or 21st century sort of mentality. That goes all the way back to how we frame and teach the institution of slavery and the ideology that justifies it. The principal legacy of the institution of slavery is white supremacy, is a belief in white supremacy that continues on after, both in the North, in the South, and in the West. And that's important that we understand, because it really shapes the contours of life in Ohio for the next 150 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Wash, did you have a comment that you would like to add?
Yeah, for first comment, Dr. Jeffries, I want to make sure I have your permission to use that phrase. Ohio's on the right side of history for all the wrong reasons. I love that, because it sums it all up. So when we talk about, the notion that because Ohio, and just that Northwest Ordinance, the Northwest Territory, that early period when we're carving Ohio out and Illinois, all of that, and they were voting on whether or not we should exist, people have to remember that was a very close vote. It wasn't like unanimous. Yeah. So when they talk about the building of Ohio, part of that ordinance, they got rid of slavery. Okay, it's going to be illegal, put it that way. They also voted on educating Blacks as well. Like, oh, we're not too keen on that. So the idea that, these were great and benevolent people that wanted to do away with slavery is for other reasons. And a lot of it had to do with the economy as well. So here's an interesting thing about Ohio. When we talk about the founding of the state, 1803, we have to remember we have Black communities here that are older than the state. We actually have some of the records in our archive. I'm mentioning one in particular. It was called Negro Town in Seneca County. It was a pretty big, thriving community of Black people. They were gifted land for their efforts, and guess what? The Revolutionary War. We have this tract of land in Ohio. It's called the Revolutionary Tract, gifted to a lot of soldiers, and Black people were a part of that as well. We have their records. And in that early period, the early statehood of Ohio, it was so many people going out of their way to legislate Black people out of this territory. They were already there, pre-existed, and they tried to find all these inventive ways. So they made some taxes, some weird taxes to try to make sure, well, if you can't afford it, we can kick you out. It's just all these inventive ways to make their lives uncomfortable and downright miserable so that they would leave this territory. So slavery has never existed in Ohio, in this entire Northwest Territory, but that doesn't mean white supremacy didn't either, because it was part and parcel to what was built here. And all of our organizations and just these structures of government were built on top of that as well. And we have to have those conversations. We have to call out the stuff as it exists. That stuff hasn't gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It has not gone anywhere. I appreciate both of you for your comments, and on the notion of slavery and white supremacy still existing. Some folks may think that Juneteenth has nothing to do with me. You know, why should I celebrate it? It does not affect me personally. It has not been something that has been a lived experience of my life. Why is this important for everyone? And what would you say to those who believe that this is not significant to them?
Well, just real quick, I would say, here's one of the things about the United States, and one of the ways I think we're unique in the world, because we have this ultra patriotic sense, right? You go to international sporting events, you always hear the crowd, USA, USA. We have this. A lot of other countries, they don't go as far as we do. So we have this national identity that we're all supposed to share and we love. What you're talking about, Juneteenth, is American history. If we love our country the way that we claim we do, people wearing the flag and all of that stuff, why don't you know your country's history? Why don't you understand the culture from which you live, right? You exist within this culture. If you were to take the African element out of the United States, out of even during the colonial period, you take that out, we do not exist as such. I think we all need to learn real and true American history. So when we talk about taking, critical race theory out of the schools, you're essentially taking US history out of the schools with it. Because we're more advanced today, 2021, than we were in 1921, as far as our understanding of our history and our culture here. We know way more than we knew 100 years ago. So why not share that? This notion that critical race theory is racist and you can't, no, it's American history. We all want to know better our own family's history, right? I do some genealogical research on my own family, find out a lot of stuff. I want to learn more. Shouldn't we have that same sense of feeling about our country and our history? So that's my answer. It's American history. It does affect you. It does matter. You're part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Wash. Thank you. Dr. Jeffries?
It is absolutely American history, right? And the reason why it's centered on sort of Black folk coming together, is because it was Black folk who kept the flame lit, saying like, look, we need to mark the moment where America takes this dramatic step, not for just purely moral reasons, because there's a lot of bloodshed involved there, but makes this major moment, a major change, with the moment where slavery ends. That isn't something that just affects Black folk. That affects everybody, right? Not just because slavery affected everybody. It changes the direction of the U.S. And we should want to mark that moment much in the same way that we mark July 4th and the American Revolution, changing the trajectory of what would become the United States, of the North American continent. Now, has this been a holiday, an event, a celebration that has been centered around the Black community? Absolutely. Like that is what that tradition has been. But for white folk, like, this is, y'all invited to this barbecue. Like, y'all can come to this one, right? This is the cookout y'all can come to, right? You come and you learn something, right? Yeah. That's what this is. So nobody should feel like, oh, this is just something Black folk. Like, no. This is something that Black folk kept alive because it wasn't being taught in the schools, because it wasn't in white schools, right? Black schools are certainly talking about it in different ways, but this is something that has always been a part of the American experience. The Black experience has always been a part of the American experience. It offers a different perspective, a different prism through which to look and to understand it. But this is something that everybody should be engaged in, because everybody needs to learn, not just about June 19th, but about what June 19th symbolizes and represents, again, before and after that day.
Absolutely. And while this is our American history, and Dr. Walsh, both of you have spoke towards the critical time that we're in right now with the critical race theory and the challenging and efforts that are happening in our schools, our education system. There are a couple questions in the question and answer that wants you to talk more about that, about, do you feel like schools are afraid to have some history lessons and keeping American history, Black history in the schools? And what is it that parents could do, not just around education around Juneteenth, but educating their school systems and those who are involved in leadership, who are making the rules and the laws to continue on with having the effects of Black history, American history remain in schools?
Yeah, we can't be afraid to teach the truth. And what's so unfortunate about this hysteria around critical race theory is that it's playing politics with the truth. Yeah, I mean, what's the critical race? All this critical race theory boiled down to is, look, you got to take seriously the role of race and racism in American society, that it has shaped and structured American society and continues to do so. That's it. It's not even that complicated. And so this whole hysteria, we can't talk about it, is folk essentially saying we don't want to talk about the truth. Now, that isn't unique or new, right? Americans have a love affair. Americans actually hate history. White Americans in particular hate history. What they love is nostalgia. That's a good friend of mine from Boston. He's like, no, Americans hate history. We love nostalgia. We love stories about the past that make us feel comfortable about the present. The problem is those stories are usually fictions. And so what we're saying now, and what folk have been saying is like, no, it's time for us to teach the truth. And this isn't about making people uncomfortable. I mean, racism is uncomfortable. Not talking about it, right? Like talking about it is what we need to be doing. And so, it's really, this could have a real chilling effect. And Ohio has some state bills that are running through, the legislature right now. This could have a chilling effect. So essentially, we're on the brink of having a national holiday on Juneteenth. And in Ohio schools, it would be illegal to talk about it. I mean, that's the insanity that we're dealing with right now. And why? Because you have political conservatives, you just got to speak frankly, right? I mean, these are all coming out of Republican controlled legislatures who are playing politics with history, right? And they know this idea of saying that, talking about race is actually racist is insane, but it will animate those who are deeply troubled by racial equality. And so we have to be clear. We can't let this kind of politics impact and influence and infect like a virus what our children are learning in school. Because as an educator, as a teacher, Dr. Wash is the same way through public history, our job is to teach truth. And when we do not do that, when we purposefully miseducate by either lying, racism isn't a problem, or pretending that something doesn't exist so we leave it out, then we are committing educational malpractice. And that is not what we should be doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. And the time that we have, and we are keeping on with making sure that we are teaching truth as part of this Juneteenth virtual lunch and learn. I want you all to talk about, and some of the question and answer, some of the questions in our chat are wanting to know, what can I do to celebrate and commemorate Juneteenth? Are there some celebrations that I can be a part of that are happening in the community that you may be aware of? And how do I continue on keeping Juneteenth and this education behind Black history alive, not only just in my households, but in my community? Dr. Walsh.
So, yeah, I would say, so going back to what Dr. Jeffries mentioned about the state legislature and the bills that are, hopefully they won't go to committee, but we'll see, about taking critical race theory out of the schools. One of the effects, and I agree 100%, you used the term, Dr. Jeffries, insanity. Thank you, because that's if we know better, we should do better, and that's not what we're doing, and to me, that's insanity. One of the effects of that, let's say it goes through, it's going to put the onus on museums like ours, cultural institutions like ours, to pick up the slack. Is that fair? It's not fair. Is that something that is doable? Not really, at least not sustainably. But the onus will be on us. So I would say, for those who are asking, what can we do to commemorate? What should we as parents try to do to bring this up with our kids? You could go to our website, ohiohistory.org. We have a number of programs. We do this every year. Our museum in Wilberforce was one of the first in the state to really publicly celebrate this early on as a public institution back in 1988 when we first opened our doors to the public. So we do something every year. And in fact, we're gonna start doing something every year at the Ohio Village. So just go to our website. We list our programs, but we also list other programs in other parts of the state because we work with our educators. They work with pretty much all of the school districts around the state. It's just what we do, outreach. So we list a lot of those other programs that happen in Lorain, that happen in Cleveland, that's in Cincinnati. So you can go to that website, and it's almost like a hub for a lot of the celebrations going on within our organization, but also outside of it. And I would say one of the other things related to critical race theory, and I know we're almost out of time, is that I think we as historians, and I'm sure Dr. Jeffries has run into this, we get a bad rap because of the term revisionist history, right? Revisionist, that's a bad word because, oh no, you guys are changing the history. You guys are changing the way we look at it, and that's not right. And to me, it shows that people just don't understand fundamentally what we as historians do. Because we take this information, raw information, and we interpret it. Sometimes we have access to material now that we didn't have access to before. We debate this material, we debate these ideas that come out, and then we sort of agree on that's the best interpretation. Yes, we completely missed this. Now we have to look back and say, wait a minute, American Indians actually were the custodians of the land. This is one of the newer things that's come out. Like they were custodians of the land, made the land much more appealing to Europeans than had they not been there, because they kind of have written American Indians out of the narrative saying, well, they weren't sedentary, so they really didn't have much to do with the land. They didn't really cultivate the land. Like, no, they were custodians of that. Some of this more recent research has borne this out. So it's like that revisionist history is what we do. We improve on our understanding, our knowledge, and we share that with the public. So it's important for us to stay the course and just ignore this insanity that's going on.
Very important. And as we close, our audience are looking for book recommendations to have more education that Dr. Walsh and both you, Dr. Jeffries, had talked about is so important. Dr. Jeffries, I'll turn to you first for some book recommendations for our audience, whether it's around our Juneteenth celebration and that historical aspect, or to learn more about our Black history and how that, what we can do today to take action.
Well, if I could offer a couple documentary film recommendations that are available online. One of the things that Juneteenth should be this time to learn about that history before slavery ends and the history afterward. And I would recommend Africans in America, which is a 4.5 hour documentary film on the African-American experience from the coast of Africa, from the shores of Africa up into emancipation. I would recommend as well 2 documentaries on Reconstruction that talks about this moment of emancipation and transition to freedom, and when freedom doesn't provide freedom for everybody. Literally PBS documentary called Reconstruction, and most recently Skip Gates sort of produced a documentary on Reconstruction as well. And then the links between the past and the present. On Netflix, I would recommend Ava DuVernay's 13th, which draws some connections between the 13th Amendment, which officially abolishes slavery, but has these loopholes that allow for the continuation of various involuntary forms of servitude, and connects that to the problems of mass incarceration that we are still dealing with today. So not book recommendations, but you can still do a lot of learning, and you can have your kids with you and watching various segments of it. And I think that all of those are really strong points of entry to learning more about this history.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to Dr. Jeffries and Dr. Walsh for taking the time to join us today. What would, just give me 2 seconds of both of your comments of what would you like to see people take away from celebrating Juneteenth this year and years to come? Dr. Walsh.
Oh, wow. To take away from today, I would say understand Juneteenth as, like we said earlier, it's more of a symbol rather than just celebrating what happened on June 19th, 1865. Look at it in terms of what does it symbolize? It symbolized freedom and hope and just that continuation for the fight and struggle for freedom and equality in the United States. And again, those African Americans who were a part of that struggle prior to June 19th, 1865, have to be written into that story as well, because there is no June 19th, 1865 without everything else that happened before that point. They're all tied together. So understand it's a bigger picture than just that date.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would only add, let Juneteenth be a starting point for learning more. Learning the things that Dr. Wash just pointed out, learning things that we talked about. Let this be a beginning of a deeper and longer and lifelong learning process. There's so much that we have not discussed in our educational journeys that we don't teach in the classroom. So let this be the occasion to dig a little deeper, not only into the Black past, but into the American past.
Thank you both so much. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. And like Dr. Jeffries said, this is also one of those moments that is that starting moment. And I appreciate this historical and robust conversation with Dr. Wash and Dr. Jeffries today. And I hope our audience has walked away learning something and feeling as if they can walk away and now are able to communicate the importance of Juneteenth and celebrate and carry on this historical important history in our time today. Thank you so much, Dr. Wash and Dr. Jeffries, and to our audience. I hope you have a really great day. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth, everyone.